When we talk about massive construction projects, what does finished actually mean? It's not just when the last bolt is tightened. It's when a project can survive the really tough trials laid out in FIDIC's Clause 9. And believe me, this isn't some simple final checklist. It's the official, contractual gate that has to be passed before a project is considered truly complete and ready to be handed over.
I mean, really think about that for a second. You've spent years, maybe even a decade, working on something. There are countless moving parts, a huge amount of money on the line. How do you actually prove that a massive power plant or a sprawling bridge is ready to go? It's definitely not with a simple handshake, I can tell you that much.
The answer lies in a super rigorous, contractually defined process that you'll find in Clause 9. The best way to think about it is like the project's final exam. It's a high-stakes test where the contractor has to prove without a doubt that every single component works exactly the way it's supposed to.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll talk about what this final project exam is all about and why the stakes are so high. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the contractor's specific duties. After that, we're going to look at what happens when things go wrong, how to handle delays, and even worse, what to do with test failures. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with the key takeaways that you really need to remember.
Okay, first up, the final project exam. It's so important to get this. The test on completion is way more than just flipping a few switches to see if the lights turn on. This is the contractual moment of truth. It's the one point that officially decides whether the employer takes over the works or not.
So at its heart, the test on completion is the formal process where the contractor shows they've delivered on their promises. This is where they provide hard evidence that the project isn't just built, but that it performs exactly like it's supposed to, making it totally ready for the employer to take the keys. So how does this whole thing get started? Well, that brings us to the contractor's obligations. Because to even get a shot at a successful test, the contractor has a really specific set of duties. And honestly, it all boils down to two things: meticulous preparation and crystal clear communication. The prep for this exam starts way before the actual test date. The contract is super clear on this. The contractor is on the hook for providing all the right calibrated equipment and making sure experienced people are there to run it. The focus is usually on the most complex stuff, the mechanical, electrical, and communication systems, which means you have to coordinate carefully with everyone, including any nominated subcontractors.
Now, the timeline for all this is incredibly strict, and for good reason. It's all about managing risk. At least 42 days before any testing, the contractor has to submit a detailed program. The engineer then goes over it with a fine-tooth comb. If they spot any problems, the contractor gets 14 days to fix the plan. And here's the absolute key: nothing, and I mean nothing, happens until the contractor gets that official notice of no objection from the engineer.
Okay, so once the program is approved, there's one last little trigger. The contractor has to issue a formal notice that says, all right, we're ready on this exact date. The second that notice goes out, a brand new 14-day clock starts ticking. The tests have to begin within that window. That's what officially kicks the whole thing off.
But let's be real. In the world of massive projects, schedules slip. It happens. Which brings us to handling delays. The contract totally anticipates this, but the rules change in a big way depending on the answer to one simple question: whose fault is it? See, it all comes down to who calls the delay. If the engineer is the one holding things up, the contractor is protected. They can probably get an extension of time and get their costs covered. But if the contractor is the one dragging their feet, the tables completely turn. The engineer can issue a 21-day notice to get moving. If that gets ignored, a second notice comes. And after that, the engineer can just step in, do the tests themselves, and send the contractor the bill for every last cent. The consequences, you can see, are completely different.
Okay, now let's really raise the stakes. We've talked about delays, but what happens when the tests finally go ahead and the project fails? This is where we get into dealing with failures, and this is where the contractual stuff gets really serious. So you've gone through the whole long process. The tests are run, everyone's holding their breath, and the results come back. It's a fail. This is the moment where the contract provides a very clear, very structured path forward. It's not necessarily game over. The process actually starts pretty simply. After that first failure, either side can say, let's do it again. The contract basically builds in a second chance, which is fair. But if the project fails a second time, well, that's when things escalate. The power completely shifts over to the engineer, who now has a huge decision to make. After that repeated failure,
the engineer is standing at a fork in the road, and they've got 4 choices. 1, they could just order another retest. 2, they could take the really drastic step of rejecting the works entirely, but that's usually only for failures that are so bad they pretty much ruin the whole point of the project. 3, if the problem is just in one area, they can use specific options for that section. And then there's a 4th, much more practical option.
And here's that 4th option. The contract says that if the employer asks for it, the engineer can go ahead and issue a taking over certificate anyway, even with the failure. This is a way to keep the project moving forward, but the contractor pays the price. And I mean that literally. The employer can then recover any costs they have, or just demand a cut in the contract price to make up for the fact that they're accepting something that's defective.
All right, let's pull all of this together in our last section, key takeaways. Because getting Clause 9 right isn't just about following the rules. It's about smart, strategic project management that benefits everybody involved. So what are the big things you absolutely have to remember? First, preparation is everything. You can't wing this. Second, those timelines, the 42 days, 14 days, 21 days, they aren't suggestions. They're hard rules. Third, always be aware that who is responsible for a delay directly hits the schedule and the wallet. Fourth, remember that a failure isn't a dead end. There's a process to follow. And finally, never forget that after a repeated failure, the engineer is the one in the driver's seat. They call the shots.
You know, passing the test on completion is a massive achievement. It's the contractual definition of "we're done." But it kind of leaves us with a bigger question to chew on. Once you get past all the clauses and the certificates, what is it that really defines a project's long-term success for the people who are actually going to use it every day? That's something to think about. Thanks so much for tuning in.